Hello, everyone. How are you? Ladies and gentlemen, members of the jury, we are gathered here in this great sovereign state of Nevada to decide the fate of the country's central bank, the Federal Reserve. In this hearing, we hope to discover whether the Federal Reserve has kept its promise to provide a healthy economy and banking system, full employment, stable prices, and a lender of last resort, or is it responsible for a series of banking crises, a boom-bust business cycle, and loss of purchasing power of the very engine of inflation and of the average citizen? Is this economy more stable, or is it less stable because of the Fed's existence? Did the Fed exacerbate the financial crisis of 2008? Or did the Fed keep it from getting worse? On net balance, they must decide this. Are we better off without the Fed? And if so, what shall we replace it with? Should we go back to the classical gold standard? Do you love gold? Are you like gold member? Can I hear a little applause for the classical gold standard? Woo! In this trial, we hope to find out the answers to this most important and pressing national issue. And representing the defense today in court, it's Professor Robert Kuttner. Professor Kuttner is co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect magazine. And Professor, woo! Yes, let's hear it. Big fans, big fans. That's right, he's a professor of social policy at Brandeis University's Heller School. He was a longtime columnist, of course, for Business Week and continues to write columns for Huffington Post, the Boston Globe, the New York Times International Edition. He was a founder of the Economic Policy Institute and serves on its board and executive committee. Very impressive, very impressive. He is the author of 10 books, including Everything for Sale, The Virtues and Limits of Markets, The End of Laissez-Faire, and the 2008 New York Times bestseller, Obama's Challenge, Americans' Economic Crisis, and the Power of a Transformative Presidency. Amen. Thank you. Hallelujah. His latest book is Debtor's Prison, The Politics of Austerity versus Possibility. Professor Kuttner, will you please remain standing? Oh, very good. As a long-standing defender of central banking, as a monetary institution, and the Obama administration since the financial crisis of 2008, you and other establishment economists have been accused of supporting a monetary system that failed to monitor and repair a fragile banking system, made the financial crisis of 2008 inevitable with its easy-peasy credit policies, bailed out Wall Street and the Treasury with its quantitative easing programs, financed the Obama administration's ruinous deficits so that the national debt now exceeds, say it with me, $17 trillion, holy underwear, and has manipulated interest rates far too long for the American economy to fully recover. How do you plead?
Not guilty.
What? Oh, yeah, I've heard that before. All right, we will begin the proceeding with 5-minute opening statements. First, by prosecuting attorney Robert Murphy, our other Robert tonight. Yes, it's the name of the night, people. Put your hands together for Robert P. Murphy, a research fellow at the Independent Institute, author of the acclaimed new book, Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action. He's president of Consulting by RPM, senior economist with the Institute for Energy Research. Baby, he's got so much energy, he could be his own can of Red Bull. He received his Ph.D. in economics from New York University and has taught economics at Hillsdale College and NYU, and worked for Laffer Associates, very serious place. Dr. Murphy is author of 7 books. And they include Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism. He has been a long-time critic of the Fed. And after the opening statements, each of our extraordinary attorneys will call two witnesses who will be subject to cross-examination. That's where it gets kinky. Then each side is going to make some closing statements. We'll have time for table tennis, and it will be quite fun. Afterward, the jury right here, look at this handsome collection of Nevadans and international lovers of freedom and liberty. That's our jury right here. Give it up for them. They will rule on the case if the defendant is found guilty. I will impose a very harsh punishment. So let me give the jury a few instructions, okay? All right, this isn't Grindr, so no swiping right or left. Let's keep it clean. I know it is Nevada. You will listen very carefully to the opening statements and to the witnesses, and at the end of the hearing, you will be required to determine whether there is sufficient evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that Professor Kuttner and the defenders of the Fed are guilty of public malfeasance. The decision will be based on a majority vote by the jury. It does not have to be unanimous, although unanimity is so much fun. Is that understood? Yes. Very good. All right, Dr. Murphy, you may begin with your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're very welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, distinguished guests, I stand here to bring the case against the Federal Reserve, as the judge has outlined. I'm going to present expert witnesses to go through step by step how the financial crisis was caused by and then exacerbated by the Federal Reserve and how the recovery was repressed by the Federal Reserve. In these opening remarks, I don't want to cover that ground. I want to step back and just provide a more general argument against the Federal Reserve as an institution. And for that, let's look at the 1977 Federal Reserve Act when it was amended at that point. Of course, the Fed was formed in 1913, but in 1977, the act was amended to say that the Fed's duty should be, quote, promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. So let's look at that. Let's see, has the Fed, in fact, fulfilled its duty as set out by statute? Stable prices, I think we can see that clearly the Fed has failed miserably in that regard. We know that there is constant price inflation since 1913, but what perhaps you don't know is that this isn't simply a fact of nature. No, it's a fact of the Federal Reserve's policies. From 1790 through 1913, it's hard to estimate these things because back then they didn't have accurate statistics, but as best as economists can say, back in 1790, if you had a consumer basket that was priced with worth $100 at that time, in 1913, that same basket of consumer goods would be about $108. Okay, so that's a cumulative 8% price inflation over that entire span. Right? So the point is, money used to be stable in purchasing power. And the point is, since 1913, of course, I don't need to even quote the statistics, by various measures, the dollar has lost 95% to 99% of its purchasing power since that time. Now, some people will say, yes, of course, when we say stable prices, we don't mean stable prices. What we mean is a stable fall in the purchasing power of the dollar. But even on that criterion, the Fed has failed. There has not been predictable steady price inflation since 1913. There have been volatile periods and then periods of relative moderate inflation. I'm sure all of us are familiar with the high inflation in the late 1970s, but there's also, from 1917 to 1920, each year the consumer price index rose from between 15 to 18%. So again, clearly the Fed has failed when it comes to stable prices or even stable falling purchasing power of the dollar. Let's move on to maximum employment. Well, we could say, has the Fed done a good job stabilizing the economy, preventing crises? Well, there's the Great Depression. That's kind of a strike against it. There's the Great Recession. That's a strike against it as well. So the two worst calamities in U.S. history happened on the Fed's watch. Some defenders of the Fed will go further. They'll say, okay, if you throw out the Great Depression, everyone gets a mulligan. If you throw out the Great Depression, then...
I love golf.
Thank you. Yeah. If you throw... I'm glad someone got the joke. If you throw out the Great Depression and look at the Great Recession and you look at just post-World War II volatility, just on that focus, some people will say, okay, GNP or GDP was more stable than the pre-Fed era. But actually, there's a 2012 paper by George Selgin and others in the Journal of Macroeconomics that shows using mainstream economists, these aren't right-wingers from the Heritage Foundation, mainstream economists, including Christina Romer, have said actually a lot of the criticism of the pre-1913 era is based on faulty statistics. They were looking at commodity series. More generally, if you just look at output as a whole, even just focusing on from the World War II period on, the U.S. economy has been less stable than it was before 1913.
1 minute warning. This is your 1 minute warning.
They teach that in law school.
They do.
So therefore, just looking at the statistics here, this isn't abstract theory, this isn't far right-wing dogma, this is statistics as published by people like Christina Roma and other respected macroeconomists, mainstream economists. say that there's a very plausible case that just even from World War II on, the U.S. economy has been less stable than it was before the establishment of the Federal Reserve. So in terms of its two major policy objectives, stable prices and a stable economy, the Fed has clearly failed. Finally, let me just point out that it's ironic at a meeting like this that we're arguing over, do we need central planning when it comes to money? If we were picking any other topic, yesterday when there was a certain economist up here, writes for the New York Times, I won't mention his name, when he alluded to the need for the federal government to run health care, there was booing. And yet, for some reason, even free market economists, many of them think the one area where politicians really are necessary, the one area where we can't trust the market, is money. That doesn't make any sense, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. The Federal Reserve is an unnecessary institution. My expert testimony and witnesses will show that it exacerbated, indeed caused the financial panic, and clearly the defense does not have a case to stand. The Fed is guilty. Thank you.
Come here, Dr. Murphy, come here. It's beautiful. Well done. I'm totally impartial. That was such an impartial hug.
Everything's
awesome.
gravy from this point.
Well done. Thank you very much. Well, now we are going to hear from Professor Robert Kuttner, the defending attorney in the case. Professor Kuttner, you have 5 minutes. Will you give us your opening statement, please?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Order! Order! I'll have you thrown out of here so fast.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I am not here to argue that everything that the Federal Reserve does is sound policy, only that we are much better off with a central bank than without it. To demonstrate why, let me take you back to the 19th century, a period when we had no central bank, no elastic currency, only the gold standard, and the money supply dictated by the accidents, the vagaries of gold discoveries. Gold determined the availability of credit, and this was a period when hard money was scarce, banks issued notes of varying reliability, and the money center banks tended to call in loans just when farmers needed them. The quantity and the cost of credit bore no relationship to the economy's needs. As Roger Lowenstein recounts in his new book, America's Bank, the economy oscillated between credit booms and credit busts. Full-scale financial panics broke out every couple of decades with severe crashes in 1873 and 1893, and the most serious depression of all, 1907. Depressions that lasted 4 to 5 years, all driven by monetary volatility and credit crunches. It was only after the panic of 1907 that populists, rural interests, business leaders, and Wall Street bankers who distrusted and even detested each other agreed that some sort of central bank was necessary. And so for the first time since Andrew Jackson had killed the second bank of the United States, we got a compromise central banking system that was federated, was based on the model of federalism of the United States. Now, the Fed has 3 indispensable functions that markets cannot perform for themselves. First, it regulates the volume and the price of credit, something that money markets cannot do for themselves because of their tendency to overshoot or to undershoot. This is a balancing act of providing the credit that the economy needs, but also taking away the punch bowl, in Arthur Burns' famous metaphor, when the economy becomes overheated. Secondly, and even more importantly, the Fed functions as a lender of last resort in a crisis, such as the collapse of 2008, and in lesser crises that might have blossomed into full-blown depressions, such as the flash crash, the Latin American and Asian currency crises, the collapse of long-term capital management, the October 1987 stock market crash. It did not do that lender of last resort job so well after 1929 because it had neither the current tools nor its current sophistication, but it has an institutional memory and it learns from history. Third, the Fed is one of the federal regulatory agencies that seeks to limit the unfortunate habits and conflicts of interest of financial engineers who often create products for their own enrichment and deceive investors, create bubbles, and then crashes. The better the Fed does that job of keeping financial markets honest, the more it can keep interest rates moderate to make capital available that the real economy needs without setting off bubbles. And finally, since the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1977, 1978, the Fed has also had a dual mandate to try to promote both high employment and price stability. And I'm happy to report that Janet Yellen is doing that job rather better than her predecessors. Now, despite all sorts of new technologies, money markets cannot regulate themselves. On the contrary, the ability of financial engineers to create dark pools of super money, everything from credit default swaps, cubed, to exploding subprime mortgages, to products that are deliberately created so that
1 minute warning.
the financial engineers can bet against them at the expense of their customers. Such techniques require a central bank to govern both monetary policy and financial regulatory policy. I say this in full knowledge of the fact that human beings and public officials are fallible, that politicians can be captured. Indeed, I've been a critic of the Fed. The Fed has often been too close to Wall Street, but history shows repeatedly and vividly that in the case of money creation, the perils of market excess are more extreme than the risks of regulatory excess. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good, Professor Kuttner. Now, Dr. Murphy, will you please call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor, I would like to call John Allison to the stand.
Yay, John Allison! Come on, give it up, people. Come on now. Let's hear you participate. This is FreedomFest. This is not a library.
Mr. Allison, please raise your right hand and place your left hand on this copy of your favorite book that you make all of your employees read, Atlas Shrugged.
Oh.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you Ayn Rand?
I do.
Beautiful.
Mr. Allison, could you please state your current occupation and expertise in the field of banking and monetary policy?
I am the very recently retired president and CEO of the Cato Institute, and before that I was chairman and CEO of BB&T, 10th largest financial institution in the United States, and I was CEO for over 20 years, the longest serving CEO of a major financial institution.
Okay, perhaps have you written any books that might be relevant to your testimony today?
I have. I've written a book on called The Financial Crisis and the Free Market Cure, which was a Wall Street Journal bestseller.
Very good. Now, Mr. Allison, could you explain, I think a lot of the people, when they think that the Fed did a good job in this and they justify it, they think that the Fed, they take these crises as given. So do you agree with that these crises just hit and then the Fed needs to be there to rescue the situation?
I do not. I do believe in a free market. You're going to have some cycles, and I think the cycles are good in the sense that markets have to clear and get rid of weakly, poorly run companies. But certainly in the last financial crisis, the Fed played the primary role along with government housing policy. In the early 2000s, Alan Greenspan, who was head of the Fed and was called the maestro, we were having a little economic correction that we needed, but he didn't want that to happen. He wanted to go out on a good term, so he created negative real interest rates, which meant you could borrow less than the inflation rate, which created a huge incentive for people to leverage, borrow, and buy houses. And that was also facilitated by two giant corporations, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, that only exist because the government guaranteed their debts. And when Freddie and Fannie failed, they owed $5 trillion and had $2 trillion in subprime mortgages. So the Fed provided the money to create the bubbles. By the way, the bubble wasn't just in the housing market. It was also in commodities markets and the stock market. Where did the money come from for a bubble if the Fed didn't create it?
So just for the benefit of our jury here, could you elaborate on that last point a bit? Because I think a lot of people believe it was policies encouraging subprime lending and to have banks give mortgages to people who otherwise might not have qualified. Are you saying that wasn't the only reason that there was a housing bubble?
There was the bubble got focused in housing because of the subprime lending, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. But Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae didn't create money. The Federal Reserve creates money. And the Federal Reserve created the money to create a massive bubble that was way beyond the housing market. People would forget there was a bubble in car loans. There was a bubble in many markets, and that is simply mathematically impossible without the Fed creating the money to make it happen.
Now, Mr. Allison, I'm sure some defenders of the Fed are going to say, okay, we don't know where the crisis may have come from. Perhaps the Fed was responsible. But given that housing was clearly overvalued. It needed to come down. Surely the Fed did a good job in handling that situation. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. I went through the financial correction in the early 80s and the early 90s. Argumentally, definitely in the early 80s, we had a worse economic environment, and yet we didn't have a crisis. The reason we had a crisis this time, and unfortunately this was under a Republican administration, was that the rule of law was suspended. The Fed, for reasons that were absolutely unclear to anybody in the market, chose to save Bear Stearns. Later on, they let Lehman fail. They saved Citigroup. They let Wachovia fail. When Washington Mutual failed, they decided to pay all the uninsured depositors. Rule of law was gone. So we were going to have an economic correction. We'd created a housing bubble, and we needed a correction. But a lot of the damage was done by the panic, which was absolutely unnecessary. There was no rule of law. And the beginning economic environment wasn't as bad as the early 80s, and it's argumentally no worse than the early 90s, and yet we had this panic. By the way, there are a lot of big banks that made a lot of bad mistakes, and I would have let them fail, but they were the secondary effect of the crisis. The Fed enabled the crisis.
I wonder, Mr. Ellison, could you briefly comment on the notion that perhaps banking was deregulated, and that might have contributed to the instability? And it clearly wasn't the fact that the Fed was too interventionist, but in fact it kept a hands-off policy. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. There was a massive increase in regulation under George Bush. We had the Privacy Act, the Patriot Act, and Sarbanes-Oxley. There's a massive increase in regulations. Banks weren't deregulated. You can just go count the pages of the Federal Register, and there was a massive increase in regulations. Banks were just misregulated, not deregulated. A lot of people point to Glass-Steagall, and Glass-Steagall played no role in the financial crisis. Banks like Washington Mutual and Countrywide had no Glass-Steagall operations. Maybe Citigroup was a little worse by Glass-Steagall, but they've been broke 3 times and saved by the Federal Reserve before there ever was a Glass-Steagall. So the industry was not deregulated, it was misregulated.
And the last question I have for you, Mr. Ellison, is obviously you're very familiar with the work of Ayn Rand and a fan of that. And could you say, do you think that the Federal Reserve, for fans of Ayn Rand, that it lives up to her ideals as she expresses in her work?
No. I would go beyond that. I've had the opportunity over the years to talk to heads of the Federal Reserve because I was a longtime CEO, and I've had people on what's called the Open Market Committee, and I've asked them a simple question. I've said, do you believe in price controls? In other words, could a group of experts in Washington, D.C. set the right price for an automobile? To a person, they say, absolutely not, that's crazy. And I say, well, isn't the Fed setting a price as a group of experts in Washington, D.C. know more than billions of competitors in a global market do about what the right price of money? And isn't that the most important price and the most complex price, and when set wrong, the most damaging price? And they had no answer.
Well, thank you. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Very good. Would you like to cross-examine the witness? You have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
5.
Mr. Allison, you referenced Countrywide and Washington Mutual. These were financial institutions that originated subprime mortgages and then securitized the paper, turned it into sliced and diced securities that were then sold off to various investors. Would you say those securities were priced accurately by financial markets?
I would say they were underpriced in general, but primarily because Freddie and Fannie were making the market. When you have one competitor, a government-sponsored enterprise that has 55, 60% market share, they're driving the pricing in the market. And they were under pressure to have at least half their loan portfolio in subprime mortgages, so they had to keep buying deeper and deeper to reach these politically correct imposed standards. So that was bringing down the pricing on the whole marketplace.
Well, would you say the securities were priced accurately before they collapsed or after they collapsed?
They were only priced accurately after the crisis was over and the market cleared. When rule of law was suspended, the prices fell lower than they would have in a free market. They were too high going into the crisis because of Freddie Mac and the huge amount of money the Fed was creating that was driving up prices, of course.
So can you describe, as a banker, what occurs in a credit crunch when one institution is so uncertain of the ability of another institution to pay back its debts that things freeze up. What is that like on a trading floor? What actually happens?
I have never been through that. It certainly didn't happen in 2008.
Didn't happen in 2008?
There was a huge flow of money to strong institutions. BB&T was buried with cash. Wells Fargo was buried with cash. There was a flight to quality going on. And the bank deposits went up. You can actually look at the numbers. Now, what was happening, the lousy institutions were getting punished by the market and were getting ready to fail. How much damage would have been done by that is a hard thing for me to know. But if we hadn't created this arbitrary and we'd let Bear Stearns fail when they should have failed, I'm fairly confident we would have had a more severe short-term correction, but we'd be radically better off today. I don't really know what the Fed should have done once it had created a panic. It's like a fireman that started a fire. Maybe they kept the whole town from burning down, but they burned down half the town.
So let me understand.
What a great analogy. My goodness.
Let me understand what you're saying. Your testimony is that the collapse of 2008, leaving aside Freddie and Fannie, which I completely agree with you, were badly run, misconceived institutions, especially after they were privatized.
Oh, you say that
but
now.
Leaving aside Freddie and Fannie, your testimony is that the Federal Reserve created the collapse of 2008.
My testimony is that the Fed created the bubble that led to the cracks. They took us on a party to the Caribbean and encouraged us to drink a lot, and then we had a hangover. And the reason that it turned into a panic was because of the arbitrary lack of rule of law when they saved Bear Stearns, didn't save Lehman Brothers, and markets can't operate when you don't know what the rule of law is. When they paid off the Washington Mutual's unsecured depositors, people can't handle that. Maybe when they pumped in a bunch of money after they'd made a mess, maybe that was okay, but it was again after they burned half the town down.
Well, what would have happened if there had been no central bank and a panic like this had broken out, as panics did break out at regular intervals in the 19th century, and there was no central bank to provide liquidity to keep money markets functioning? What would have happened?
Well, I tell you, first, your study of the 19th century, we never had a free market banking system in the United States. We had state-run banks, and banks were highly regulated in a different, inefficient way. And secondly, when they did have panics, they had much more severe correction, but they were very short. Markets cleared and things went on. I would argue if we had in Canada, there was no banking crashes, and they had no central bank going through the Depression. In Scotland, they had 100 years with all totally private banks that actually printed money. There was no central bank at all, and they never had a serious correction. So I would say we wouldn't have had the bubble if we'd had a private banking system. We would have had little corrections all along. People are not omniscient. Markets are going to correct, but you can't make that big of error except with government policy.
Thank you very much for your testimony.
Professor. One last question from the judge. Okay, so say we're on this Caribbean cruise, right? And they give us so much booze that we get so sick. Was the thinking that these banks were too big to fail, that Fannie and Freddie were too big to fail, like us being too sick to vomit?
You can call that analogy. I've never thought of it in those terms.
Wait. All right, thank you very much. John Allison, let's give it up. Very good. All right, Dr. Murphy, please call your second witness, if you will.
Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call to the stand Mr. Steve Forbes.
Steve Forbes! Are there any Forbesians in the house?
Mr. Forbes, please place your hand on this edition of Forbes 400 Richest. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
The God of Mammon, yes.
All right.
Mr. Forbes, could you please state your occupation and your qualifications to provide this testimony to us today?
I'm editor-in-chief and chairman of Forbes Media, and we've been following the machinations of the Federal Reserve almost since its inception My grandfather wrote the story about Jekyll Island, which created the Federal Reserve back in 1912, 1911. The Fed actually was created in 1913, but the mechanism was put in place before that. So we've been following for a number of years, and I recently co-authored a book called Money, about how the Federal Reserve has made things worse, not better.
Well, yes, let's follow up on that last point there for the jury, if I may. How is the Federal Reserve, a lot of people will say, well, the Fed was there, it had to provide some sort of assistance. It's better than having nothing, but you're arguing that the Fed actually made things worse. Could you explain?
Well, every major economic crisis, huge crisis like the Great Depression, the great inflation of the 1970s, and this recent debacle were all caused by government mistakes, massive errors in government policy. In the 1970s, it was the Fed that printed the money that caused that terrible inflation and wreaked havoc around the world. Reagan and Volcker in the early 1980s stopped it. Now people say Volcker was the head of the Fed, didn't he stop the inflation? Yes, he set the fire and then put it out. But why set the fire in the first place? And you have it, as John Allison pointed out, in the early part of the last decade, the Fed went on a binge again, created excess money. That led to the commodities bubble, the housing bust. And then the other thing that's not fully recognized is since the crisis of 2008, 2009, the Fed is the principal reason why we have this punk recovery today. They put in monetary policies that feed big government, feed big corporations with pricing of credit, but starving credit for small and new businesses. This so-called zero interest rate, that sounds great, but as they used to say in the Soviet Union, the health care is free, but you can't get any.
Now, Mr. Forbes, I'm confused. The mainstream media says that low interest rates are the medicine and the Fed's doing what it can to bolster the recovery, and you seem to be suggesting the opposite. Can you explain this?
Well, it's like the doctors in days of old, when you had an anemic patient, you bled the patient. That ended up doing more harm than good. In this case, by wrecking the credit markets, putting in price controls, it's like rent control, great when you have the apartment at least before it deteriorates, but you don't get a properly functioning housing market anymore. In terms of what they've done in the credit markets, by messing them up, they've made short-term credit unavailable to small and new businesses. By mispricing credit, banks are under, if you don't know what the price of something is, you're going to get less of it out in the marketplace. And in terms of what the Federal Reserve has done, is bank regulators, and the Federal Reserve is the biggest bank regulator, they pound on banks when they make loans to small and new businesses as risky, and at the other hand, they applaud when you lend to the government. So the government gets free money. You remember, at the end of the year, the Federal Reserve turns over all the interest, most of the interest after its expenses, on its portfolio. So it's like you have a mortgage, and at the end of the year, the bank pays you back the $10,000 of interest you paid on the mortgage. You'd say, boy, that's pretty good. Uncle Sam gets back from the Federal Reserve the trillions of dollars of government bonds that the Federal Reserve holds. Uncle Sam rebates the interest back to the Treasury Department. Good deal for government, bad deal for the American economy.
Mr. Forbes, I find this hard to believe. You're telling me that when the federal government established the Federal Reserve, created this cartel of banks, let's call it, that it did so partly to benefit itself? This seems inconceivable.
What an outrage.
Yes, governments are always selfless. And reminds me after World War I, and a historian discovered this in the 1950s, when the British, which had the largest navy in the world, they sharply downsized the Navy. And while the Navy was being downsized, the agency running the Navy got bigger, more bureaucrats. That's what happens with government. You see it in the Defense Department today. Uniformed personnel down, bureaucrats running them up.
You have 30 seconds.
Okay. Just one final question for you, Mr. Forbes. You may have heard that the defense has argued that the Fed needs to be there to be a lender of last resort, to provide liquidity. Do you have any thoughts on whether that's a justification for the Fed and its policies?
Well, if done right, yes. The Bank of England showed back in the 1860s that if you had a credit crisis, you could go to the bank and an above-market interest rate with your good collateral, get a short-term loan, and then you're out of it. That could be done in a matter of weeks. And in the United States and other countries where you didn't have a central bank, You could have, not in the U.S., but in other countries, you had the banks coming together and pooling money and making emergency loans. We had various laws in the early 1900s that prevented that from happening with what you saw in countries like Switzerland, Canada, and the like. So you didn't have an effective lender of last resort. But the banking systems are quite capable of doing it. If they know the rules of the game are, you muck up, you go out. You let the bad go, preserve the good.
Very good. Thank you very
No
much.
further questions, Your Honor.
Your witness, Professor Kuttner. Do you want to stand over here so it doesn't look so much like Freudian analysis?
Thank you.
Great.
Mr. Forbes,
Yeah, it's
are you on the Forbes 400 list?
No, that's why I read Forbes. I'm trying to get on that list.
Well, I wish you every success. I was intrigued that you said that the Fed was somehow responsible for the collapse of 1929. The history...
No, I didn't say that. I said the great inflation of the 1970s.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'm glad to correct that misperception. After that collapse, then Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon famously or infamously said that all of these cascading business failures would purge the rottenness from the system. Do you subscribe to that view?
That crisis was caused by government. First, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and you can go in 1929, 1930, as that legislation started to make its way through Congress. That's when the markets collapsed. And you can go over the daily headlines. And late Jude Wanniski's book, The Way the World Works, shows that when that legislation looked like it would be halted, which would destroy the global trading system, stock market recovered. When it began to become a reality, the stock market crashed. That was sin number one. Sin number two was when the contraction started, governments raised taxes catastrophically. They did it in Germany, they did it in Britain. Here in the United States, we raised the top income tax rate overnight from 25 to 63%. We wondered why the economy continued to contract. So government plays the role there. I don't worry about Andrew Mellon. I worry about what government does when they muck up trade and muck up the tax code.
But let's okay. I attributed what you said to the Fed. I want to talk about what government did or did not do in the 20s. If I read my history correctly, the 20s was a period of almost no financial regulation. The Federal Reserve was a new institution, and financial engineers on Wall Street invented stock pools, invented gimmicks where bankers were borrowing from their own bank to speculate, where sketchy loans to third world countries were securitized and sold to customers, where public utility holding companies watered stock and passed the cost along to ratepayers. How was government implicated in these inventive activities of the private market?
Well, when you have a bad product in the marketplace, eventually it gets flushed out if you let it get flushed out.
So that was 1929.
We've had stock market tumbles before 1929 and after 1929. For example, in 1962, we had the most terrible day in stock market history. But we didn't go in and massively raise taxes and destroy the global trading system, and the market recovered. So in terms of stock market crashes, the stock market crashed in 1929, not because of pools and the like. It crashed because we're destroying the global trading system, just as what happened with World War I destroyed the global trading system. We did it in peacetime, and the shooting came later.
So 1929 was not a bubble in your view?
You may get a bubble, but then you have a correction and the thing goes back again. You get enthusiasms. For example, in the early 1980s, we had great enthusiasm for PCs, personal computers. Everyone knew this was a big deal. So everyone piled in. You had the inevitable shakeout, and then the industry came back again. In this country, in terms of automobiles, which was a huge industry in the early part of the last century, we've had over 1,000 automobile manufacturers. People saw a great opportunity. So it gets flushed out, and the winners go on and prosper. But that's normal. You're always going to get ups and downs. The economy is not a machine. The economy is individuals. Get over it.
Where is the inflation that folks have been predicting as a result of the Fed's bond buying program? People have been predicting.
Have you seen the price of arugula? Am I right?
Well,
where's the catastrophic inflation that's been predicted?
Well, you've had some inflation, But what you've also had, and this is the big difference between us and the 1970s, you've had an enormous regulation on banks not to leverage reserves into loans. That's why the M2 money supply number has been anemic, even though reserves have grown at twice the rate they did in the 1970s. So you have a combination of zero interest rates, which benefits government and big companies. Why would Apple, with $150 billion of cash, borrow $40 billion? Because they could. And so, again, you allow markets to operate, they will usually work pretty well. Human beings are not perfect,
They're not.
but they're better than government.
But they're super sexy.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you so much, Steve Forbes.
Thank you.
Steve Forbes. A high five from the jury. That's a good sign for the prosecution right now. Dr. Murphy, any more witnesses?
No more witnesses, Your Honor. The prosecution rests.
Very good. They are resting. They are sleepy. That means, Professor Kuttner, it is now your turn. Who would you like to call first?
Yes, I'd like to call Mr. Alex Green.
Oh, Alex. Yay! What's up?
Mr. Green, I need you to put your hand on the Oxford communique where your face is apparently on it.
Okay.
All
Swear
right.
to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth on your own face.
Mostly.
Mr. Green, thank you for being with us. Would you state your involvement in Wall Street as a newsletter?
I got to start with a confession.
Yeah, go ahead.
I spent 30 years as a money manager, research analyst, financial writer, and I'm currently the chief investment strategist for the Oxford Club.
Terrific. Now, would you say you're a left-winger?
I'm one of those wild-eyed libertarians.
Libertarian.
That's the mating call right there.
Now, do you believe, given
Is that
your
Bitcoin in your pocket? Or you just happy to see me?
Not telling.
given your views and your experience, do you think we are better off with a central bank or without one?
I'm not going to argue that we're necessarily better off with a central bank, but I would argue that because of what the central bank did during the financial crisis, we're better off.
And why is that?
Because cash and credit are the lifeblood of the economy. They grease the wheels of commerce. And
I love a greasy wheel. I'm not even gonna lie.
where was I?
Dude, that's what I said this morning.
You were saying that
it was
credit
the mating call,
is
I'm
the
sorry.
lifeblood of the economy and greases the wheels of commerce.
All right, so the grease the wheels of commerce. So when the financial system breaks down to the point where Morgan Stanley doesn't trust Merrill Lynch enough to lend it money overnight, the whole system is in danger of imploding. And if no one had stepped in and done anything, and we'd had a collapse of the financial markets and a deep deflationary depression, then business owners, investors, and everyday Americans would have suffered a lot more than they did during the financial crisis.
Yeah, but you heard the witnesses, the expert witnesses for the prosecution, say that this is no big deal, that markets take care of themselves, that shakeouts are normal. Why is this sort of credit crisis, this credit crunch, different when the whole money market seizes up?
Yeah, because extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. Ordinarily, I would be a non-interventionist.
Right.
But when you have a situation like this, where, for instance, Tim Geithner in his memoir mentioned that at the height of the crisis, we were less than 3 days from the banks not being able to distribute cash in the ATMs. You're talking about pandemonium. I mean, even the Greeks get 60 euros. so it would have been bad news for Americans. So the fact that the Fed stepped in, slashed rates, provided liquidity, supported the systemically important banks is a good thing, not a bad thing.
All right, we have about 40 seconds more for this one.
Well, this is a really interesting philosophical question. You're a libertarian. What is it that is different about money markets if we believe that most other markets are self-correcting? That's really the heart of this debate.
Well, usually markets are self-correcting because a seller will take advantage of prices that are out of whack, and buyers will step in. But when the system freezes up and there isn't the cash or the credit available for people to take the steps that need to be taken, you end up with the sort of long, dangerous, deflationary situation that Japan has suffered with for 26 years now. And that's what scared the Fed and why the spigots have been wide open is it's very difficult once deflation takes hold to turn things around again. So they took extraordinary measures to keep us from getting into an extraordinarily
That's right.
bad
I've always said
situation.
it. It's like economic herpes. You know what I'm saying? Like once
all-
you got
It's
it.
for life.
It's all off.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Your
thank
witness.
you very much, Professor Kuttner. Dr. Murphy, would you like to cross?
Yes, Your Honor.
Whatever you want to go. Wherever you want to go. Let it go. It's like Frozen, baby. Go for it.
Okay, Mr. Green, you said
Nelson.
something very surprising. I believe, was I correct in hearing you say that you're not going to sit here and argue that we're better off with a central bank than without one? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
You realize that would have qualified you to sit on the jury.
Should I change place?
I hope your next witness actually agrees with you. Okay. Now, Mr. Green, so is your argument basically then that given that the Fed may be a bad institution overall on net, the thing that's under consideration for this trial, but put that aside, is it your position that given that we were in the midst of that financial crisis, what the Fed did was absolutely necessary?
Yes, it is in my judgment, what the Fed did was necessary. It was hasty, it was improvised, it was imperfect, but is it better than having done nothing? Absolutely.
Okay, but can I push you further? Are you saying, though, but you're open to the idea that it would have been better had the Fed not even been there in the first place? But so given that there was a Fed there that had all these powers and everyone was looking to the Fed to do something, perhaps, yes, it needed to do something rather than nothing, but it is conceivable that that situation itself was partly because of the existence of the Fed.
Can you repeat the question?
Could someone read it back? No, the quick answer is no. Let me rephrase. We'll put it this way, that we had other expert witnesses up here saying that we should not take the crisis just as a fact of nature, that the reason the panic was there was because the Fed and other officials had been picking and choosing, bailing out some firms, leading markets to believe, oh, they're going to rescue us, and then shocking everyone by saying, no, we're going to let Lehman fail, for example. Do you agree with the general spirit of that criticism?
No, I disagree. I think that the Fed perhaps did leave interest rates too low for too long going into the housing bubble, but the housing bubble was created by both political parties encouraging people who could in no way afford a home to buy one. That was problem number one. And they also exempted the first $500,000 in capital gains on a house, fueling the fire further to buy real estate. Then the bubble got underway and animal spirits got loose and people started bidding things up to crazy prices, and I don't blame all of that on the Fed. So the bubble was, when the housing bubble burst and the subprime market collapsed, that was the true cause of the financial crisis.
3-year-old's birthday party. We have like 10 seconds.
Okay.
I mean, do you guys want to like hug like we did?
Okay,
earlier?
Mr. Green, quick question. Have you ever been to a bowling alley?
A couple of times.
Okay, they rent shoes out there, right?
Uh-oh.
Okay, exactly. Would you trust?
These are mine.
Would you trust a group of officials in Washington to regulate the price and quantity of bowling shoes?
Probably not.
Okay, but you would with money. That's interesting. What kind of a libertarian would say that? No further questions.
I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you very much. Oh, he's good. I'm not even lying. Professor Kuttner, do you have a second witness you'd like to call?
I do indeed. I call Professor Stephen Miller of the University of Nevada here in Las Vegas. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, very nice to see you. Welcome to the courtroom of freedom.
Professor, can you tell us about
Swear me in?
Yes, I'm so
Brian
sorry.
Calle
We need to
here?
swear you in.
Brian Calle,
Okay.
¿dónde
I
está?
guess I can say whatever I want.
Where is
right?
the bailiff? No, we need, yes, thank you, bailiff.
I was trying to save some time.
You are so
I'm
sweet.
trying to help with the program.
Oh,
All right,
what a
you
lamb chop.
You have to swear on Milton Friedman's Free to Choose.
And?
Well, just for posterity, we didn't really trust you, so also the Grand Theory by Keynes. Here,
so we-
both at the same time. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
You got it, partner.
All right, because Milton Friedman's my boy, so you better not mess with that.
So I think between Friedman and Keynes, we get the truth. Could you describe for the jury the nature of your academic work?
Well, I'm a macroeconomist. I've been doing this for 45 years, 31 in Connecticut and 14 here in Las Vegas. And more recently, I've been doing some work on the volatility of output growth. I first did it for the United States and then for Japan, then a bunch of OECD countries, basically post-World War II data. The most recent paper, however, looked at the United States from 1876 through 2012, that's it. Over a century of data. And The results of that study suggested that the sample divided into 4 different periods. The gold standard period, the interwar period, post-World War II up through 1981 and 1981 to the present.
Thank you. Would you say that the economy was more volatile back in the era when we didn't have a central bank?
Well, in fact, the measures that I looked at suggested that the economy was more volatile in terms of real output growth, both in the gold standard period and in the interwar period. Of course, in the interwar period, the world economy decided they wanted to go back to the gold standard. They set some bad parities, and it did not work.
Why would the economy be more volatile in a period when there was no central bank?
Well, the central bank can play a role when they do things correctly in controlling the movement of the economy. That's not always the case, however. We know the Great Depression was an example. I'm sorry.
There we are. We're great.
That the Great Depression was an example when the central bank failed in their activities.
Can I ask you
but
a question?
You certainly may, Judge.
Thank you very much. Did we have more financial volatility before there were Kardashians?
I think the Kardashians contributed to the financial volatility. I think that's what happened.
Fair enough.
I was asking you, what were the in the period when we had financial panics in the late 19th century, every 10 or 15 years, what was the role of the absence of any central bank in these credit crunches?
They couldn't step in and try to prevent a bank panic from getting out of control and leading to a recession or a depression. So if you look at the time periods, you notice that during the gold standard and during the interwar period, we had many more cycles than we had after World War II. The cycles tended to last about 4 years, 2 years of recession, a little less, a little more than 2 years of expansion. Since World War II, the expansions have gotten longer and the recessions have gotten shorter. And I'll remind the audience that we're now looking at the 7th year of the current expansion, which is the average for the 1981 period. So
I take it you don't endorse every single thing that the Fed has done, but on balance, do you think that we're better off having a central bank than not having one?
The Fed has done lots of things that were not correct. But you have to consider the central bank is like an insurance contract. You buy insurance on your home because there's a small probability that you might have a fire and lose the whole investment. So the Fed is an insurance contract against the fire in the economy.
All right, very good. Thank you very much.
Your witness.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Murphy.
Dr. Miller.
A lot of doctors here. My arm hurts every time
Judge,
you do this. Does
can I
anyone
take
have
the fifth?
Yeah. You can take a fifth of Jim Beam if you want, baby. I don't even mind.
When was the Federal Reserve established?
1913.
And when did the Great Depression happen?
1929.
Okay, so just to be clear, the Great Depression, the worst crisis in U.S. history, clearly happened on the Fed's watch.
Exactly.
Okay.
The most recent financial crisis pales in comparison to the Great Depression and a lot of the recessions in the gold standard.
Okay, so just to follow up on this, so you're saying we should give the Fed a pass because this last one was not as bad as the other one they caused?
Don't give the Fed a pass. I agree with Milton Fried and Anna Schwartz on that they were responsible in large part for the Great Depression.
Okay, speaking of that, yeah, Governor Ben Bernanke, he was governor at the time, I'm sure you're aware of this, in November of 2002 on Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, said, he gave an address directed at Milton Friedman, and he was also talking about Anna Schwartz, said, "Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I would like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it, we're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." Do you think that that's something Mr. Bernanke is particularly proud of, that statement?
I think he was accurate in saying that.
Because the Fed has not caused another Great Depression, merely the Great Recession?
Well, I think the Great Recession was a lot shallower than it would have been absent the Fed's actions.
Okay.
One can debate about, how important was the Fed in getting us into that crisis, but my view of the housing crisis, the subprime lending problem, and the financial collapse, everyone in this country was guilty.
Guilty.
Okay.
Murmur, murmur.
One final question for you. One of the previous witnesses alluded to Walter Badge's famous dictum that in a time of crisis, if you are going
I didn't even know him. All right. Go ahead.
Stay in character.
As you were.
Financial crisis that if you're going to have a central bank, what it should do is to lend freely, but at a penalty rate of interest. And are you familiar with that dictum?
Yes. Yeah. My view is that the number one job of the central bank is to be a lender of last resort. And there's a lot of other things they do. I know we have the Humphrey-Hawkins Act. I would prefer they focus on inflation control, not get involved in unemployment and output.
Okay, now do you think that...
You said that was your last question.
It was a line of questioning.
You're so chatty.
One more?
Go ahead, one more.
Thank you, Your
Uno
Honor.
más. My español is so bueno. Go ahead.
Given that the Fed's going to be there to provide liquidity as a lender of last resort, do you think that the public should have some oversight, or do you like the current arrangement where even when Congress calls Bernanke in front of them in late 2008 and say, who would you give these trillions of dollars in loans to? And Bernanke said, this is a paraphrase, but very close to the spirit, I can't disclose the recipients because that would defeat the whole purpose of the program.
Oh, God. You have like 10 seconds.
Well, the issue there is whether the central bank needs to be independent. And if the Damocles sword is hanging over the Fed, that the regulation might be changed, the government might decide to do this for the Fed or disband the Fed, get rid of the Fed, that inhibits their effectiveness in implementing their policy, in my view.
Thank
All
you.
right, Dr. Miller, thank you very much. Dr. Murphy, you may be excused. Any further witnesses, Professor Kuttner?
I could probably call dozens of witnesses, but I think we've made our case, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, very good. So what are we going to do? We're going to conclude these court proceedings with closing statements to the jury. First, we're going to have Dr. Murphy and then Dr. Kuttner, of course, Professor Kuttner. We don't have time. What about like a minute? Whoa,
He's
you guys,
guilty.
this is out of my hands. I mean, this has just evolved into utter chaos. You don't know what's going to happen at FreedomFest. That's why it is such a beautiful banana split. All right, so will you mentally, telepathically, for 5 seconds, transmit your thoughts to the audience and the jury? Ready? That was awesome. Very good job. Okay, thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard various witnesses through the proceedings. It is now to you to decide the guilt or innocence of the Federal Reserve. It is your job to determine whether the preponderance of evidence supports the prosecution. That is, that on net, the federal balance has a dangerous and excessively powerful institution, that they are a powerful institution in today's economy, that it encourages irresponsible banking practices, stimulated artificial booms and busts, and allowed the government to grow by leaps and bounds since its inception, all the while depreciating the value of our currency? Or are you to decide for the defense if you think the Fed has done, on net balance, a credible job of keeping our economy strong and stable, defending a strong dollar, protecting us from another panic on Wall Street, or even another Great Depression? Holy Prozac. The foreperson will tally the votes and announce the verdict. The decision by the jury can be by majority vote. It does not require unanimity, as we discussed earlier. Is that clear, jurors? No, very good. Are there any questions? All right, so here's what we're going to do. They're going to decide among themselves, who is your foreperson? Oh, they've already written things down. They're so organized.
We have it. I think give it to the judge.
Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have.
Very good. Will the defense attorney, Robert Kuttner, and a star witness, blah, 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 will you stand and face the jury? They're
I'm
already
just
back
the
there, don't worry.
defense counsel.
That's okay. All
I'm
right.
not-
Madam Foreperson, how do you and your fellow jurors juricize?
We have 9 in favor of guilty, 2 for not guilty, and 1 for abolish the Fed.
Oh, wow. Those are some very powerful votes. Madam Foreperson, thank you so much. All right, there you have it. The Fed is guilty, 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 guilty. All right, Professor Kuttner, you and your Fed supporters have been found guilty of subverting the public good and failing to limit the powers of the Federal Reserve. Therefore, by the powers vested in me, I hereby condemn you and all Fed supporters to the Fed's debtor's prison. And listen to this, it's about to get good, where you will be under obligation to pay the toxic debts of all FreedomFest attendees here tonight who may, yeah, that's right, what? Yes, who may have lost their collective shirts at the craps tables at Planet Hollywood. You can only get out of debtor's prison if the Federal Reserve finally raises interest rates. Marshal Kaye, take him away.
Jail.
I'm the lawyer.
To jail or to the banquet. There's a banquet.
No,
No, it's okay. There's a banquet tomorrow night, $95. You can come with me. No, it's good.
No, I'm the lawyer.
All right, he's the lawyer. He's flush with
stronger than he
cash.
looks.
The night is young. Professor Kuttner, Dr. Murphy, jurors, and of course, much